If you've done any rigging at all, your previous experience probably includes using a chain hoist. Hoists like this one are pretty adaptable tools. You've seen how they can make straight lifts when they're suspended from the overhead, and you may have experience using one or more chain hoists on the load hook of a crane for leveling or fine control of a load when it's being raised and lowered. What we're going to do now is talk about three specialized operations you can do with hoists: tilting a load up on one end, turning a load over, and walking a load. Upending a load can be done with one hoist. Turning a load over is done with two hoists. Walking a load is when you use two or more hoists to travel a load when you don't have a crane or rollers. We'll start with turning a load on its end. We want to rotate this load to the right so that it's standing on what's now its right side. Before we rotate the load, we have to find two things: the load's center of gravity and its tip point. This load is a regular shape, and its center of gravity is right about in the middle. The tip point is here. This corner will act as a pivot as the load's tilted up on its side. These two pieces of information help us decide where to attach to the load. Imagine a line that extends from the tip point through the center of gravity and beyond. On this load, it crosses the corner opposite the tip point. The best place to attach to the load will be right below this line. When we lift from this position, the load's controlled all the way up. As the center of gravity passes the tip point, the hoist can be used to set the load down gently. You'll notice that we need some travel on the hoist to make the motion smooth. Let's see what happens when we attach at a different spot. This time we'll attach above the line. The load rises easily as before, but when it's tilted as far as it'll go, the center of gravity doesn't pass the tip point. Instead, the load's lifted off the floor. To make the load tip up, we'd have to push the load over. It's not really under control. Here's what happens when the lift point's too low. Once the center of gravity passes the tip point, it tips over suddenly without positive control. This can easily damage a load. For our last example, let's see what happens when we tilt the load up without hoist travel. As it's tilted, the bottom corner drags across the floor. Unless a load is specially protected, you don't want to tilt it this way. Most of the precautions involved with this procedure are aimed at preventing damage to the load. There are really two key points to remember. First, you have to select the right lift point, and second, the hoist has to travel. This can be done either with a crane or a hoist on an overhead track. The next operation we're going to see is turning a load over, so the bottom side will be on the top. We're going to be using two hoists to turn over this pulverizer rocker. The first step is to attach a sling to one end of the load. The sling's coupled to hoist number one. As the slack's taken up, one rigger tensions the sling so it doesn't slip out of position. When the sling's tight, he changes position so he can steady the load as it's lifted off the floor. Since the lift point's off-center, the load will tend to swing unless it's held onto. This hoist doesn't travel, so there's no way to avoid having it slide on the floor to some extent. More fragile components would need special protection underneath. The load's raised until it's slightly off the floor. Then another sling is attached to the other side of the load. This time they're using an endless sling to make a basket hitch. Both end loops of the sling are attached to the load hook of hoist number two. As the second hoist is raised, it slowly rotates the load, pulling it around so that its weight is evenly distributed between the two hoists. The load steadily cranked around until it's past the perpendicular position. Then padding's placed between the sling and the component to keep the sling from damaging the flange. Once it's past this point, the first hoist is lowered so that the load begins to level out. When it nears the floor, both hoists are lowered away. Then the load's gently landed on the floor, upside down from its original position. These are two ways of handling a load and putting it in just the position we want. Turning it on end and turning it all the way over. Both of these operations can be performed either with hoists or with cranes. Next, we're going to see a method for moving a load to another place without a crane, skids, or rollers. It's called walking a load. The first thing is to get the load up in the air. Here we're using one hoist with a come-along to balance the load. When the load's off the floor, the second hoist is attached to the same shackle. Then the first hoist is cranked up so that the load will be a little higher off the floor. The second hoist is raised to take up the slack in the load chain. Now both hoists are supporting the load's weight. As the second hoist pulls the load to the side, the first is let out to keep the load at about the same height. The load's not lifted any higher than is necessary for the job. This is what walking a load really means, moving it from hoist to hoist in short steps. When the first hoist goes slack, the load will be directly beneath the second hoist. Then the first hoist can be moved beyond the second one, and the operation can be repeated, one step at a time. As the load moves toward the right, the second hoist bears more and more of the weight. When the first hoist's load chain begins to slacken, its hook will be removed from the load. While the second hoist holds the weight, the first hoist will be moved to another position to the right of the second hoist, and the process will continue. What you've just seen is the simplest way of walking a load. Only two hoists are required, and a load can be traveled any distance, as long as there's something overhead from which hoists can be hung. We're going to take a look at another method now. It's a three-hoist technique. It's used when you have a long or bulky load, and you have to use two hoists just to get off the ground under control. Here's the load suspended from two hoists. The next step is to add a third hoist, attached to the overhead along the direction of travel. As you tighten up on hoist number 3, the load moves to the right. Once it's in this position, it's being supported evenly by hoists number 1 and 3. So hoist number 2 can be switched to the trailing end of the load. Hoist number 1 can then be slacked off until the load is suspended directly beneath 2 and 3. Then number 1 can be moved and the process repeated. Walking a load is a special technique that's used in a variety of situations, whenever you don't have a traveling crane, a dolly, or rollers to do the job. Whether you're using two hoists or, for some larger loads, 3 or more hoists, the principle's the same. You walk the load along by progressively moving your hoists farther along the direction of travel. As you take up on the hoist in front, slack off on the rear hoist to keep the load level and at about the same height. So far, we've discussed 3 special hoisting techniques: turning a load up on end with one hoist, turning a load over using 2 hoists, and walking a load with 2 hoists or more. These are just a few of the ways that you can use chain hoists to handle a load that's too heavy to move by hand. Later, you'll get a chance to try out these techniques as practice exercises. When you do, remember 2 safety points. First, don't load a hoist at too much of an angle. Try and keep the lift chains as close to vertical as possible, since angled lifts increase chain tension. Second, make sure you've got a solid connection to the load. Pad eyes or shoulder-type eye bolts are necessary whenever you're pulling at an angle.